So just a quick review. We've been doing Michaelis-Menten or steady-state kinetics. It's hyperbolic. So it's pseudo first order at low substrate concentrations. We proved that, that whole limit as S goes towards 0. I don't know why I did that. There shouldn't have been air quotes. It really is the limit as S goes to 0. And then 0 order kinetics at really high concentration substrate. No air quotes needed. So I told you you're going to have to, I don't know why it's so blurry here, but it's not on that. I don't know. I haven't checked the video to see if it's very blurry or not. But essentially you have to memorize at least the Michaelis-Menten equation. And then as long as you know how to manipulate it, it really helps out for answering pretty much all the logic, like the math questions that will be asked here. Vmax is equal to Kcat times ES. This is the definition. Remember, Vmax, or Kcat I should say, is called the turnover number. That tells you the ultimately, like the fastest it could ever be. But it doesn't tell you how efficient it is, how specific it is for that specific substrate, and that enzyme is for that specific substrate. So for that, we use Kcat over Km, or Vmax over Km. That's the specificity constant, also known as the catalytic efficiency constant. Also, the way that Km is Michaelis constant, it's word-wise, it doesn't sound like it means a whole lot. Literally, it's the substrate concentration that you're required to have to get 50% Vmax. But it's almost like a barometer. It kind of gives you a relative idea for the substrate's affinity. So the higher the affinity that substrate has, that enzyme has for that substrate, the lower the Km. Okay, which sometimes people get that back, and that's also true for Kd. Kd is the dissociation constant. It's literally a binding constant. That's very specific. The reason why, and I didn't tell you this, but the reason why, and I don't think your book even tells you this. The big difference, this way that you have it, because in your papers a lot of times they may give you Kms, or they may give you Kd, or they may give you both. For some of the papers that you may be reading or that you're writing, Kd tells you more information specifically. But let's say that we have a generic, we're only looking at binding, and it goes on. So it goes on and on and on. That was K1 and K minus 1. Kd literally means dissociation constant. And so when you're dissociating, it means you're taking something, you're breaking it apart. So the products for dissociation is free enzyme times free S. It's an equilibrium constant over ES. I've seen people get it backwards. If you write it with the ES on top and free E and free S on the bottom, that's a KB, that's a binding constant. And those are weird. The reason why is the units for KDs are like units just for Km. They're going to be like in molar or nanomolar or micromolar. The units for KBs are inverse that. And so I don't know about you, but for me to think, okay, what does inverse 9 nanomolar really mean? What does that mean? Not inverse 9. 9 inverse nanomolar, that doesn't mean a whole lot. Whereas if you look at big KD, those are in units that people are used to seeing, like in molarity. Or grams per mole. Grams per milliliter, things like that. Okay, so that's Kd by definition. It's a dissociation constant. Km, this is the mathematical definition. It's also, technically it is a dissociation constant, but it's not a dissociation constant just based off of ES. So if there's only one enzyme bound, Kd and Km are the same. This is not very grammatically correct. But let's say for the example that we were doing earlier where it was ES and an EP, by definition, Km is E times divided by EP plus ES. So that's why it's not exactly KD for substrate, but it's very similar. So sometimes people use it interchangeably, but technically that is wrong. And I don't know how detailed, you never can tell for the MCAT, like, are they going to be really detailed where KM is this and KD is that or not? But KM in general does give you a vague idea, a good idea of substrate affinity. So if we have, let's say that we've got an enzyme that's got two different substrates, so it's called A and B, and substrate A has a Km. Km of A was equal to, say, 5 micromolar, and Km for substrate B was equal to 10 micromolar. What that tells you is A binds tighter than B. Because the lower the Km, the lower the amount of substrate you have to have in order for the reaction to occur. Okay. So that's where Km is kind of like a barometer in that sense. Whereas Kcat over Km or Vmax over Km tells you the specificity, how efficient it is, and then Vmax or Kcat gives you an idea of ultimately how fast it could ever go if the conditions were just right. It gives you an upper limit. Yeah?
Did you say A was tighter?
A is tighter because the number is lower. The lower the number, the tighter it is, because it has to be dissociation, so it's an inverse relationship. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. Today we're going to be talking about, okay, this is McCain-Smithton and it's hyperbolic. We also went over Lineweaver-Burk, which is a double reciprocal plot. And so that's where, when I showed you how to go about doing that, what each point means on that. And it looks something like this. So we talked about all this, and this is where we left off. Now we're going to be starting to talk about inhibitors. And if you go in to take enzymology, which last I checked, the registrar's office forgot to put it on the schedule, even though Dr. Schwab sent it over. But if you decide to take we'll go more into inhibitors, especially with respect to medicines and antagonists and agonists and stuff like that. This is very medically relevant, very much so. But there are different classes of inhibitors. Oh, wait, before we get, there's a couple of things. This just shows you examples. What happens, so far we've only been talking about one substrate, but there are different types of mechanisms when we have more than one substrate, and that happens all the times. Like I already said, but like double displacement reactions that we've been talking about in intro to chemistry, where they swap partners, that can also happen, that can stuff. You can imagine that there are a couple of different ways to break it down. One of which is called, one is whether or not it forms a ternary complex. Ternary complex means that the enzyme and both substrates have to be bound at the same time, or if there is no ternary complex that's formed. Okay, so here let me make this smaller. So let's say if there is a ternary complex that's formed, if it doesn't matter the order they bind, this is what it looks like. You can imagine substrate 1 binds and then substrate 2, or substrate 2 binds and then substrate 1. It doesn't really matter. It's random. And then they go on to make your products. Yes, there may be an EP here. This is just showing you the simplest. If it's ordered, that means it does matter. You have to bind one of them, then bind the second to make a ternary complex, and then it goes on. And once again, there could be an EP1, EP2 complex and stuff in the middle. Now, if there is no ternary complex, one good example of this right here is the aminotransferase reaction, which we go over. We actually write out that mechanism next semester. What happens is the first substrate binds. It usually modifies the enzyme somehow. A lot of times this is a covalent intermediate. And so the first product may leave, and you've got this modified enzyme where the second substrate comes in, you get your enzyme back, and you get your second product. And so you can imagine, it's called a ping-pong mechanism because there's a ping and then there's a pong. You have to do one and then you do the other. But let's say aminotransferase is where you're transferring an amino group from one thing to the other. What happens here is the enzyme binds whatever's going to be donating the amino group. It actually puts the amino group on the enzyme, quite possibly. That's what this E is, and then the first product leaves. And so now this E has an amino group on it, and then the E transfers the amino group to the second substrate. And so you get your enzyme back. This is one example. Okay. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Okay. But inhibitors. Because I forgot that one little blurb about ternary complexes. Okay, we've got two big classes, and then we've got subclasses of those. So first, like if I was making a big flow chart, which I made before in the last class because the projector wasn't working, you either got a reversible inhibitor or an irreversible inhibitor. I'm going to start with irreversible inhibitors first because they are not as interesting. Okay, but so if it's irreversible, it means once the inhibitor binds to the enzyme, it's dead. It's irreversible. These are also called suicide inhibitors because they kill the enzyme. Aspirin, by the way, is technically a suicide inhibitor. Aspirin goes in, it covalently modifies a specific amino acid on the enzyme, the COX enzyme, and it's irreversible. The enzyme's dead. Okay, so that's why usually there's some covalent bond. It's either formed a covalent bond, it broke a covalent bond, it broke something, and it's lost. That's why I say it's important, but the enzyme's dead. I mean, it's gone. It's gone. No crying over spilled milk, move on. Bambi's mother's a goner, that kind of thing. The Titanic went down with that.
Old Yeller.
Old Yeller. Kind of thing. So then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about reversibles. So what happens like I said, actually, medicinally, both are very important. Okay, our body naturally uses the reversible inhibitors a lot to do feedback inhibition. That's not to say that there aren't any naturally occurring irreversible inhibitors, but actually, you can, in a big scheme of things, you can think of ubiquitinolation, which we cover. Did we cover it this semester or next semester? That may not be next semester, but ubiquitin is actually a protein that gets added to various things. And whenever other enzymes and proteins are supposed to be slated to die, one way to do that is the proteasome can come in and it recognizes it because a ubiquitin transferase adds ubiquitin to the protein that needs to be dead. So you add it, and it's in the market as being dead. But technically, it's still reversible. I guess in theory, your body doesn't reverse it, except for histones. Okay, the reversible inhibitors. There are 4 big classes. I think your book may only cover 2. It used to be that the book covered 2 and mixed. Because mixed literally means it's a little bit of both. I want to say the book covers 2 and the NCAT covers 2, but not necessarily I can't remember now. At least the old NCAT I think covered non-competitive and not uncompetitive, but a lot of books do competitive and uncompetitive because of the fact that they occur more frequently in nature. So I just cover all. Okay, that way we did it all here. So there are 4, but one of them is mixed, means it's a mixture. Okay, and it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. So there's competitive, non-competitive, and uncompetitive. You have to think about it as with respect to the substrate. Usually, with respect to when we talk about competitive. Okay, I'm going to break these down. Let me make sure I go in the same order, because I have been known to do that before, where I went into a different order. Just because they can draw the cartoons better than I can. Here we go. So we can see here we've got this enzyme. Let's imagine that there's at least 2 binding sites in the enzyme. One of them is where the substrate binds. If it's a competitive inhibitor, that means the inhibitor binds to usually it binds to the same binding site, or it binds adjacent to it. Like in theory, you can imagine something really big and bulky where if it binds here, it's going to block the binding directly. So that's why it's competing for that same area of the enzyme. That's why it's called competitive inhibitor. Whereas a non-competitive inhibitor means it binds somewhere other than that, but it causes some type of conformational change that results in a non-productive binding of the substrate. Okay, so now the substrate, that's why I think, see, it's really nice and jagged here, but now it's a little curvy, and that nice and sweet. And so that's a little cartoony way of saying it. I'll show you uncompetitive because uncompetitive is hard to draw that way. So let's think about, and that's from the old book. Let's think about it in the kind of reaction mechanism schemes that we've seen so far and explain it. And then we're going to put that to Michaelis-Menten and Lineweaver-Burk graphs. Like, what does it look like? So this is a really important concept to get down. So this is competitive. So we have E plus S makes the Michaelis complex to makes E plus P. If it's competing for the same binding site, that's what this little cartoon is trying to show you, that means it can only bind to free enzyme. Okay, because if the substrate's already bound, it's taking up that same binding site, or it's preventing the inhibitor from binding. So what that means is that this is a step where the inhibition occurs, and they give it an equilibrium constant called Ki. And so and literally Ki is the dissociation constant for the inhibitor. Okay. And so it would be free E times free I divided by EI. I'm going to do it that way, but once again, the lower the number, the tighter it binds. So if you have an inhibitor, like whenever I did biomedical research, inhibitors that we were trying to look at, we're talking about, like if we could find something that's in the nanomolar range, that's really, really good. Because that means if you had a few nanomolar, it would inhibit at least 50% of the reaction. Some of the old terms that sometimes you can see are called IC50s, complex 50s, that's the same. It's related syncing. Okay. Oh, well, it's very, very similar. It can be something. So now, let's think about what this means with respect to binding, to our graphs. So there's our little cartoon thing. I prefer not to do that. I prefer Michaelis-Menten. They're not as easy to draw, but it's easier for me because that way I don't have to think in reciprocals. Remember, it's V versus S if it's Michaelis-Menten. If it's uninhibited, what's the shape look like? We're assuming that these all can do Michaelis-Menten steady state kinetics. What's the shape on Michaelis-Menten curve? Say it with some conviction. Hyperbolic. That really is crappy. Okay, so let me try this again. That's not too bad. So we're going to go ahead and put in all the information. That asymptote's not the best, but that's Vmax. You know, that's the asymptote. It probably needed to come down a little bit. But as long as it makes logical sense when you guys draw it, then that's fine. So for us to do Km, you could go to about the 50% mark. On the y-axis, you go over, and you go down. Because remember, Km is always a substrate concentration. Technically speaking, if I ask you to put Vmax over Km on this graph, which I'm not going to here because of the fact that it gets a little busy, I would have to make it really big. But the way to do that is you would draw the tangent right here, and remember, it's the slope of that tangent. Because it's the slope as it approaches 0. So it's the slope of this part right here. But it's just kind of hard to draw that, especially if we're going to be drawing other things on there. That's Vmax over Km. That would give you a much more precise number than if you literally find Vmax and divide it by Km, because we have error. You can see my big error right there, right there for Vmax. That just shows you that there is error inherent in that, whereas if you find it directly. Okay, so now let's just look. Let me go back here so that way, which I've been trying to convert the lectures into video, so hopefully that will be up soon. I had some internet issues in my office today, even with the Ethernet. All right, so if we just look at this, or if it's easier for you to look at it this way, that's fine. If inhibitor is binding to this free enzyme, is it going to affect Vmax, Km, Vmax over Km, or more than one thing? Okay, so that's why we have to now start to think about it. So remember, this is a competitive inhibitor. So we have, and I could say Kcat instead of Vmax, because they're directly proportional. Km and Vmax over Km. This is one of the reasons why I really like to take my time with, and hopefully you don't mind me taking more time for this chapter than I do for other chapters, because it's usually pretty formal, pretty much new territory. Do you think, it doesn't matter, which one would you guys like to start off with, Vmax or Km? Because this makes sense to do last.
KM.
Km! Thank you, I'm so glad you said that one. Oh, right. So, do you think it's going to have an effect with Km? Will it affect the Km?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, it does affect Km. Because remember, Km is all those enzyme-bound intermediates. Okay? Because it means, remember when we talk about word-wise, Km was the amount of substrate you needed to get to one half of Vmax. It's going to make it look like you need even more substrate, because that substrate's going to do almost like a bumper car kind of thing and bump off the I. So Km, do you think it's going to go up or go down? Up. It's going to make it, my old boss would always tell you, it's an apparent Km, because it makes it appear like it's going to increase. Okay? Now let's think about it with respect to Vmax. Remember, and we actually solved this. Your book, actually even here, it doesn't even show you. This came out of the book. But, remember this is K2, which was equal to Kcat in this scheme. Remember, that was the simplest scheme. That's one of the reasons why I liked the fact that you start with Km. I didn't say, yeah, kept with Km. So, let's just say K2 equals Kcat. That does not look anything like K2 or Kcat. Sorry about that. It looks like H's. Those are my H's. All right. What effect, if any, do you think is going to have on Kcat or Vmax?
Shouldn't affect Vmax.
It doesn't affect it. Because once Vmax, which is what I did Kcat, that's only the step after substrate is bound. So it has no effect on it. So there is no change. You can either put no change, NC. I'm going to put NC. Okay. No change. So then Vmax over Km, is it going to be no change, up, or down? This is where I like to use mathematical logic here. If there's no change on Vmax and Km is increasing, what's the effect going to be on Vmax over Km? It's going to decrease, because this number is getting bigger and that number has no change. So, yes, so it's going to go down. That's why I said, if you can, as long as you know Michaelis-Menten and kind of start to play around with the logic behind it, you can get a lot of these. Sometimes it's just trying to think it through. Taking the time to think it through can take a while. Okay, so I'm going to draw it in this color for the inhibitor. What that means is the Vmax is going to be the same, but Km is increasing. Ooh, that's not too shabby. Okay. So the Vmax is, in theory, going to be the same right there. But now the Km is way out here. I'm going to call it Km prime, just so that way you know it's different, or Km apparent, or Km plus inhibitor, or whatever you want to call it. You just cannot call it Ki, okay, because that's something different. And don't call it something like Fred. But now you can also see here, see the slope of this line right here is also smaller than the slope, not as steep. You know, this one's steep and high, this one's smaller, more shallow. So you can see it here on the graph that it affects Vmax over Km as well. Now let's draw the Lineweaver-Burk. Lineweaver-Burk is 1 over V, and 1 over S is this axis. Remember, it looks like this. So this point right here is 1 over Vmax. So I usually like to do mechanism first because it's direct. I don't have to try to think about it. Reciprocal and things. This one's actually really easy to put the Vmax over Km. This right here is equal to -1 over Km. And the slope of this line, does anybody remember what's the slope? Km over Vmax. We mathematically proved it, but yeah. For those who just want to try to sit there and memorize everything you possibly can memorize from the entire chapter. Yeah. But no, this is key. Okay. By using the logic already, we can draw it in. I like to figure out logically first and then draw it versus trying to draw it and I'm less prone to making mistakes. We know, so I'm going to change colors now. We know Vmax is the same. And we know that Km increases. So if Km, this is why you have to now really sit down and think it through. If Km is increasing, what's 1 over Km going to be? Getting bigger or smaller? Smaller. So that means -1 over Km has to be somewhere over here. And it also means that, and you know that's -1 over Km prime. The slope here is Km prime over Vmax. So it actually gets steeper because it's an inverse. You know, normally in real life, in the real world, it's kind of like Stranger Things from Netflix. Someone got it. Okay, I still haven't finished season 1. I lost interest. So, but that's beside the point. But no, in the real world here, we had it where the Vmax and Km got smaller. So that means that Km or Vmax is actually going to get bigger. Because it's reciprocal. That's why I like to do the cases. They're harder to draw, but it's easier for me to make sure it makes it less likely for me to make a mistake. Okay. Let's see. I think that's what this is. I forgot that here. Oh yeah, this is just writing out all the words. There's the dissociation constant for Ki. Once again, notice it's free enzyme inhibitor over the bound. And so the smaller the Ki, the tighter the inhibitor, the better the inhibitor is. That's where I seem to try and write it out a different way. This is what it looks like. Please don't memorize this. This is where there's lots of memorizing. This is what it looks like as the Lineweaver-Burk. And what they like to do is your book will call this terms in parentheses that 1 plus I over Ki. Mathematically, I forgot what that term is called. I don't remember now. They call it alpha. Alpha prime. But it's, you know, they call it something else just so that way it makes it easier for they don't have to write it out every time, I think. So that's where that alpha or alpha prime is in the book. It's just this one, this whole parentheses part. But I wouldn't ask you to derive this because it takes a long time. All right. So now we're going to do uncompetitive. That was competitive. Now let's do uncompetitive, which is one that comes out of Lineweaver-Burk. We'll hit on the non-competitive. Just make sure before I lie. We'll hit non-competitive last. Oops. Okay. So uncompetitive means it's not. This is where it gets really confusing. Uncompetitive and non-competitive are 2 different classes of inhibitors. And I apologize for that. I wish we would call it something new. But uncompetitive inhibitors bind to the McHugh's complex. to form a ternary complex. That's what they're showing here with the little cartoon things. Just in case you want to draw it out and write it all out. I used to attempt to try to draw these cartoons out myself, but mine all look like mutated Pac-Men. It is okay to laugh at my corny jokes. It helps bolster my fragile ego, in case you couldn't tell. No, I'm just kidding. See if you're paying attention. It's why I should get paid the big bucks. Oh, I really wish I could figure out how to do that. In case you're wondering, the link I shared was, I'm sure it was the GIF file. I put because my mom and dad are moving here. They're actually, they sold their house. They are currently in the moving van on their way down here. And so I put this like little GIF file from the old Seinfeld episode where they're all dancing and stuff, saying that we were all happy they were coming. And so now various people have been commenting like, oh, congratulations, all this kind of stuff. So that's why I did like a day or two back, but they're still commenting. So, all right. Because somehow Facebook, even if you try to turn off notifications stuff, it comes in through the app. Oh, where does it come through? All right. So here, no, it's not. We are forming a ternary complex. So we have E plus S, those make the Michaelis complex, and then the inhibitor binds here. So they call it Ki prime, but it's still just a K. It's still a Ki. This is still what you'd be comparing to see if whether or not how strong the inhibitor is. And one thing that we a lot of times in real life, we talk about an inhibitor, but it may be that the ESI complex can go into product, but instead of being 100%, maybe it's like a half of 1%, where it's so sometimes they're leaky. So just in case they use terms like that in papers. Okay, so we have the ESI. Now let's think about what this is going to do. I forgot exactly how. So this one's for uncompetitive. We now need to think about Vmax, Km, and like I said, I usually like to wait and do Vmax over Km last. You don't have to, I guess in theory. You can do it whenever you want. I'm going to draw the Michaelis complex, the Michaelis-Menten. Always get used to putting down your axes, because those are the kind of points you don't want to mess on quizzes and exams. Try to get, I like to call them easy points, or those are mistakes, simple mistakes that people often make. Michaelis-Menten is V over S. Meaning Y over X. Okay, and once again, what's the shape of the wild type curve look like, the uninhibited curve? What's that shape called? Hyperbolic. Oh, that one's much more pretty. This time, especially, I'm going to work backwards to where I'm going to cheat to make sure that it looks better. Ah, there we go. It's got a much better Vmax. Do the Km. You know, something bad's going to happen because this one just looks way too pretty. Oh, sound effects optional. I love it. Okay. I wish today was Friday. Okay. I'm tired. Wait until you're in your 40s. And your energy level. Sorry, and then you're a first-time father. And he's sick. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong. And so she had a doctor's appointment too. So let's see. Doctor says, just keep doing what you're doing. Yeah, he screams and cries. He's allergic to lots of things. But in just over 2 weeks, he gained over a pound. That's good. All right. So I forgot where I was going with this one. All right. No, okay. Now let's think back here. Once again, it doesn't matter to me where we start. Do we want to start Vmax or do we want to start Km?
Keep it consistent.
Let's keep simple. Hey, I like that. Km. So, how is this one going to affect Km? Is there going to be no change? Is it going to make it go up or down or what? For an uncompetitive inhibitor, or I should say, once again, it's an apparent. So, remember, Km has to do with the ES complex. Kcat has to do with the ES complex, right? Right? Because in this instance here, we're going from ES directly to product. So, do you think it's going to cause it to? For an uncompetitive, there is a change. Oh. Yeah, there is a change. So, what does that mean? Now we have to really think this one through.
Well, the inhibitor is going to keep the substrate on there, right?
Yes, it can.
So do you need less?
The apparent will be less. Then this is where, if you knew the mathematical definition of Km, it would help. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why I like to give it to you. Remember that mathematical definition of Km is equal to free E times free S. And I would not ask you this on the exam unless it was like a bonus question or something, just because I don't have you memorize what the mathematical definition of Km. But remember, it was the summation of all enzyme-bound intermediates. So now we have two of them. Before, we just had one, ES. And now we've got two enzyme substrate bound. Now, if there was a P, EP, there would be an EP at the bottom. So because of that, this number, if you think about mathematical using proof, like mathematical proofs or logic, this number is getting bigger. So if the number is on the bottom is getting bigger, the overall number Km is getting smaller, apparently getting smaller. So it's going down. Okay. What about Vmax? Is Vmax going to go up, down, no change?
It would go down, right?
It's also going down. Because it's harder, you can think of it, it's harder for that ES up here to form. And so it's going to look like it's going down because it's being siphoned away towards this direction, directly. Before, it was only free enzyme. Once the substrate bound, it didn't matter. So it's also going down. So in an ideal situation for an uncompetitive, what do you suppose is going to be happening to Vmax over Km? It's got an apparent no change. So now we get to draw all that. Which sounds like it's going to be really hard. Yeah?
What do you mean when you say apparent?
Because I say apparent, because this isn't it's not a true Km anymore, or true Vmax. Like the true Vmax is what happens if there's always substrate in the enzyme. Okay, that's why this is something that we should, it's going to look like the Km is decreasing, but the Km for substrate really isn't. It's only that it looks like it's getting lower and lower because of the fact that the inhibitor is also binding.
Okay.
Just because in the lab and the hospital that I worked in before, they were always real sticklers on using the vernacular. I don't think your book says apparent. They write it out with those little alphas instead. Okay. So it sounds like it's going to be really hard to draw, but it's really not that bad. So it's in this red or pink or whatever color. It means this portion of the curve is going to be identical, roughly. But Vmax is going to be smaller, and Km is going to be smaller, so it's going to look something like this. There we go. Down around 0, they overlap. Now we can put in Vmax. I really made this drastic. It may not be this drastic, but I'm doing it so that way it's easy to see the differences when we draw it all out. It's even easier to draw on Lineweaver-Burk. This one is, at least. Where course, now this is a new Vmax, which I'm going to call Vmax prime, but you can say, oh, and it doesn't have to be where the 50% was before. Like I said, that was just random. I didn't mean to do that. You could say Vmax plus inhibitor or whatever, just to show that it's a different one from before. The Km, once again, you go right around where it's 50% or so of Vmax. If you want to, you can make sound effects. Boop, 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 and go down. And this is the new Km, or the Km, the apparent Km or Km prime or whatever. Plus inhibitor. Well, this is for uncompetitive inhibitor. Oh, awesome. Now I'm going to draw the Lineweaver-Burk. Like I said, Lineweaver-Burk is even easier now that we know what we know. So this is without inhibitor. Of course, once again, this is 1 over Vmax. I wish I would have made it bigger. This slope here is equal to Km over Vmax. And this is equal to -1 over Km. Okay, so we said that Km was getting smaller. So will -1 over Km be getting smaller or bigger? So this one's going down. It's going to get big. So and if you need to, and I used to do this, I'll put numbers in. Km before was 10. So 1 over Km can be 1/10. So versus or whatever. As it goes down, things like that. So if this is going down, then this number will be down, which means overall it's going to be. Why am I not drawing something? I'm telling you, it's been a long week already. It should be over here somewhere. Likewise, now this is where it's going to be hard for me to draw it. You're just going to take my word for it. I'm just going to give it away. It's supposed to be parallel line. That's not too bad. Freehanding. So this is now the new -1 over Km prime. And once again, this is the slope for Km over Vmax. All of its prime. And then this is 1 over Vmax prime. So the Km over Vmax, since it's parallel, they should be the same. Since Vmax over Km is no change, then Km over Vmax will no change. They should be nice parallel lines. Okay. Why did I do it that way? Okay, so there's their picture, which is not so much prettier than mine. See, that's where they stick in the alphas. This is mixed. So with mixed, do you think it's going to go up? Vmax. Okay, let me check this. What will be changing? Vmax, Km, Vmax over Km. Once again, we can. Yeah, this one, I had problems trying to draw this one. Sorry. So once again, this is for the mixed. Oh, whoops, sorry. Mixed. The Vmax, Km, Vmax over Km. Does anyone know? This is what it looks like. I'm actually going to give you the Lineweaver-Burk first. Oh, whoops. I was using black before. Oh, and I forgot to put in my axes. So this is what it looks like without the inhibitor, right? As you add inhibitor, this is what it looks like. Let me make sure that I can draw this correctly. I didn't do a very good job, I'm sorry. Their point for them all meeting has to be somewhere in that, is that quadrant one? I can't remember for my quadrants now. The negative, positive, negative quadrant, it doesn't fall on any of the axes. That's why it's relatively easy to tell whenever it's mixed. And just like before, you can do negative 1 over km. You can do your Vmax over km. You can do your Vmax. All of them change, apparently. Because the only thing that they intersect somewhere in this quadrant here. Okay. Non-competitive is one of the easiest to draw, but it's one of the hardest to explain. Yeah.
So, Km, Vmax, which one goes up, which one goes down? I mean, wouldn't it depend on what happens? I mean,
It's a mixture.
so really, you don't know.
No, not necessarily. It's a little bit of both. So you can say here, based off of this one right here, since the apparent Km is going 1 over Km is getting smaller, that Km there would be getting bigger. But then at the same time, the 1 over Vmax is getting bigger, so then Vmax is getting smaller. So it's a mixture. So that's why it's going to depend. You're going to have to sit here and try it out and use logic there behind it and all this. And what you'd find out is as the inhibitor increases, typically it's going to get closer and closer. The slope is going to get closer and closer to big numbers.
So what you want us to know, just basically that the lines get to intersect with the other line.
Yeah, the lines intersect. They don't intersect on any of the axes, and they're not parallel to each other. Well, the other one was parallel. They didn't intersect at any time. Okay. Non-competitive is the hardest one for me to draw. Not to draw on the graph, but to write out. I'm going to show you. Whoops, that was mixed. There's their picture is a lot prettier than mine. Non-competitive, what it means is the substrate doesn't affect the binding. I'm sorry, the inhibitor doesn't affect the binding of the substrate at all. It's as if it's not there, but it affects catalysis. So that's why I was saying that it's easiest. It's probably the easiest one to draw, especially on Lineweaver-Burk. It's really easy to draw. So because of that, this is what it's going to look like. So this is non-competitive. And non-competitive does happen quite often, or can happen quite often. Vmax, since it makes it difficult for catalysis to occur, Vmax is going to go down. But since it doesn't affect substrate binding, there's no change. Okay, and since there's no change to Km, but Vmax is going to go down, what do you suppose is happening to Vmax over Km? It's going to go down. Okay, so that's why this one's pretty simple to draw. I'm going to draw the Lineweaver-Burk first. 1 over S, 1 over V. This is what it looks like. Because now I'm not going to go through and draw it all out, like what all the parts are, but you should know where Km is, or how to find Km and how to find Vmax on that. Now, once we add the inhibitor, Km is the same, so negative 1 over Km is going to be the same. Vmax is going to go down, so that means 1 over Vmax is going to go up. So it's going to look like this. That's not too bad. So they meet, in the Lineweaver-Burk, they meet on the x-axis. Yeah, x-axis. Competitive meets on the y-axis. Non-competitive meets on the x-axis. Uncompetitive are parallel. And mixed, they meet in that quadrant off of everything. Then to draw it on Michaelis-Menten real quick, and this is where we finish up. There's S, there's V. It's not supposed to be X, it's supposed to be V. It's hyperbolic. That one is ugly, but we're gonna go with it. Just so that way you get used to seeing it all written out. It's Vmax. And here's Km. This one is actually one of the harder ones for me to draw. So Km has to be the same. So I'm going to go to that pink color. So that means that this has to be the Km whenever it's inhibitor too. So what I do is I pick a point if I want to show an example, and then that's the new 50%, so that means that this has to be the new, you double it, that has to be the new Vmax. And once again, I don't take off for drawing, like your ability to draw or not to draw. Well, oh, that's not too shabby. So that's what it looks like.
So the new Vmax has to be 50% of the Km. Is that what you just said?
Not 50% of Km, it's twice. Km is 50% of Vmax.
Right. Okay, yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So the Km is the same. I went to 50%. So it's the same 50%, and I doubled it to get the Vmax, just so I could draw it, because it's the hardest one. But yeah, this Vmax prime is not related to the new Vmax at all. And once again, I probably made it much more exaggerated than what it was to show. Yeah?
Did you put that point that you drew for the new, with the inhibitor, did you put that anywhere on the...
Anywhere on that line.
Okay, and then just double it?
I just did it really low like that, so that way you can clearly see one from the other. Yeah, it's going to have the same Km, the same vertical line. It's going to be on that same vertical line. I don't know why I have problems with vertical horizontal. Maybe it's some type of learning disability. I get them wrong. Your book here, what's in, they like to talk about the alphas and stuff. This is what it looks like if you solved and derived it within the Lineweaver-Burk. So as you can see, it's ugly looking. And they call this alpha in your book, but alpha is 1 plus I over ki. But it does take into account. But you can actually use it to solve for ki and all that kind of stuff. All righty. Oh, there's their pretty picture. Which actually, that one I think I may have swiped from a Google or something, probably. All right.